Hi everyone, and welcome to the Galactic Collaboration Summit 2020. I hope you, your families, and your loved ones are healthy and safe. In the next 30 minutes, I'll be presenting my ultimate tips and tricks on Power Apps, whereas I'll be sharing my personal experience based on a very recent project on how to make the best of this amazing platform. Let's get into it. A little bit about me. So my name is Ahmad Najjar. I'm based in Oslo in Norway, and I'm a senior consultant at InfoWorker. I'm a passionate, enthusiastic developer, heart and soul, and I have more than 15 years of experience in Microsoft technology, basically SharePoint, working with SharePoint PnP and PowerShell. And as among others as well, I work with Power Automate, Power Apps, and Logic Apps. To help empower your people and elevate their talents, Microsoft combined the capabilities of 4 services into a unique and powerful low-code development platform. While the Power Platform has capabilities which will impress any developer, it is also designed to be approachable and accessible to those in the best position to identify transformative applications, those who work on the front lines of a business. Now, digital transformation means more efficient use of your data to gain insight, which facilitates more intelligent business processes and decision making. However, organizations cannot achieve the efficiency with only programmers or data scientists. So they need other people. There are people that are sitting on the front line to be able to jump in and use these functionalities and services. Now, the Power Platform is a singular low-code platform that spans over Office 365, Dynamics 365, Azure, and standalone applications. The Power Platform services are individually valuable and better together. So, for example, you could call a Power Automate from an alert in Power BI, or you could call a Power Automate from Power Apps and even return the data to Power Apps. Or even you could call a Power Automate from Power Virtual Agents during a chat. So they're well integrated together. We talked about the Power Platform's services integration, but they well integrated together, but the integration does not end there. Power Apps is also connected to Microsoft Dynamics, for example, unifying your business or from data to people to processes with modern intelligence business apps that adapt to your changing needs. It also integrates with Microsoft Azure for all your cloud computing needs, and with Microsoft Teams, of course, to ensure that the employees you're helping through the apps are able to collaborate and use those apps within Microsoft Teams, for example. In this session, we're going to go through a bunch of disconnected tips and tricks. They're not related to each other. Some of them are, but they're actually disconnected tips and tricks. So some of them are about coding and the other are about design. So my first for the tips and tricks are using local and global variables. I know this is one of the most obvious tips and tricks that you might think of, and as a developer you probably have used that multiple times, but we're going to go through on how to use those ones and when and where do you actually use those local and global variables. So there are 2 types of global variables. So we have the syntax of set, which is the first one, which is you will set global variables, and it's the simplest one. It could hold number, text, boolean, record, table, etc. That can be referenced from anywhere in the app. The second one is collect or clear collect, and this holds a table that can be referenced from anywhere as well in the app, allows the contents to be in the table, and that can be modified instead of just setting the whole variable. And can be saved into a local device for later use as well. And that's what I mean by can be partially modified, is actually instead of setting the whole variable, you could just modify a piece of this table or a record in this table. Next are local variables, or we call them context variable. And they are screen scoped, or they could be hold a value until the app is closed. So they're great for passing values to a screen. You could use that when you use the navigate. So when you use the navigate function, if you're moving from one screen to another, you could use an update context record that it will pass a value into a screen. Or they are much like parameters, to a procedure in other languages, and they can be referenced only from one screen. So you could use those variables only within the context of a screen. So for the first demo, we're going to show you how to use the set to setting global variables, and as well for doing the table collect or clear collect. So if we look at this button, we'll see that I'm just setting the global variable or global var to the value that is passed in, or the text that is passed into the text input. And as well for the collect, what I'm using is I'm doing a collect, and I'm calling this city populations. And this is information that I got in here for city populations, London, Berlin, Madrid, etc. And I'm exactly doing the same here, but instead I'm using the clear collect, but I'm using the same data set here. So when we run this and just try to change the data in here, and I set that variable, you could go to the next screen, so you could see that here it's set. If I change that and then set the variable again, and you could see that the variable is set again to that. And as well for the collect, so the collect is actually accumulate the data. So as you can see here that the data is collected. But if I go back again here and click collect again, so the data will be duplicated. So you'll have London twice, Berlin twice, etc., etc. So if I go back here, the clear collect is actually clears the whole collection and then reinsert that again to that variable. So if I click that, we should be fine. So the data should not be replicated now. As for the local variable, what I'm using here is I'm using a local variable that I set on increasing and decreasing here. So what I'm doing is I have this called progress bar, and it's just checking the value that's set in here for the leap interval, and then it's adjusting the width of this control that we have in here, sort of like a progress bar. So if we run this and put the leap interval to be 50 and then increase that, so the width will be increased as 50, and then if we decrease it, it's the same. So if we do this like 100, so that will be increased by 100s. If we put it as 1 and decrease it. Next is the app object on start event. Like a control, the app object provides properties that identify which screen is showing and that prompt the user to save changes so that they are not lost, for example. Every app has an app object. So the onStart property runs when the user starts the app, often used to perform the, for example, the following tasks. So you might want to retrieve or cache data into collections by using the collect function, or probably you want to set up global variables by using the set function, or probably you want to navigate to an initial screen by using the navigate function. Notice how I used the onStart event here for the app. So if we click on the app here, you'll notice that there's the onStart event. And inside of the onStart event, we have a variable that's called greetings, and it's checked the time. So if it's less than 12, it's good morning. If it's less than 18, 6 p.m. In the evening, so it's good afternoon. And otherwise, it's just good evening. And I'm just passing this greeting item into the header that I have here, or component, which is basically changes over time. So once this app is started, it will set this variable here, and then based on the time, it will pass this to the header that I have, which is the header component. Next is the filter, search, lookup, sort, and distinct functions. Now, I cannot stress how important those functions are for slicing and dicing your data when you're working with data sources. But still, like, there are some things that you need to have at the back of your head while working with those functions. So we have the filter function, for example, that finds records in a table that satisfies a formula. And the filter is used, for example, to find a set of records that matches one or more criteria, and the rest of the records are discarded. That does not match the formula. The lookup is used to only return one record. The search is used to search for a certain string, based in one column or multiple columns. Sorting is used, of course, for sorting the data, whether they are ascending or descending based on one column or multiple columns, while the distinct function is to evaluate a formula across each record of a table and returns just one column based on that formula, and all the duplicates will be removed. So the name of the column that comes back from the distinct function is called result, not the exact name of the column from the data source. Now remember that the tables that you're using with those functions could be of any type of a source or a data source. It could be a SharePoint list, it could be a collection, or it could be a filtration result, meaning that you could use a combination of those functions together. So one thing I want to point out here is delegation. Now, Power Apps formulas, filtration, sorting, or shaping the data need to minimize data moved over the network. So in short, Power Apps will delegate the processing of data to the data source rather than moving the data to the app for processing locally. Meaning that if the data source does not support delegation, you will not have the right filtration based on the formula that you supported in the filtration or sorting. So you need to make sure that if you're working with data that is over 500, to look at delegation table from the Power Apps documentation. In this demo for the filter function, I'm using three galleries in here, and I'm returning the filtration result based on the country. So I filter this based on Germany, this one is UK, and this one is Spain. So if you look back again to the galleries that we have here, so this is filtered by country, this is Germany, this is UK, and this is Spain. But we want to be more intuitive in terms of filtration, so we could use the distinct function here. So what I did here is actually I used the distinct function and I collected all the countries, because apparently inside of the data set the countries are repeated. So I don't want that redundant data to be shown inside of the drop-down list in here. So if you look into the drop-down list, you will see that it's returning the distinct of city populations and then country, and then returning the result, which is basically is just the countries. And I could just filter the countries based on that, and I'm just passing whatever I select in here in the gallery in here. So I'm using both the filtration and the distinct function. So for the next one, I'm going to be using the search. So instead of just putting the data, I will just search for countries. So I'll say, like, if I want to look for Germany, so you'll find these. If I want to search for like any country with an I, this should be United Kingdom and Spain. If you want to look for example, Spain, then you will find Madrid and Barcelona, and so on and so forth. So you just give the user functionality or a free text functionality that will be able to pass into here and then search for the data. So if we look into the gallery again, you'll see that this is searching based on the passed in text in the input text and just checking the country. For the last demo, so we're going to see this is going to be a combination of everything that we have seen. So you could search based on a city and then select a country, and then you would sort those search results. So this is just for the sake of demo. I know that probably the country should be first and then cities, but this is just for the sake of demo. So we have Germany, for example, and I want to see all the ones that have I in them. So you could see here, and then sort them by population. So you can see this is a combination. So the gallery in here is just using a combination of everything that I find in here. So this is a combination of functions. And if you look at the function, how it does look like, so it's just sorting first by the columns, and if it's checking if the sorting by population, and then checking if it's ascending or descending based on what you choose on that button. But inside you have a filtration, and inside the filtration is a search. So the search is the source for filtration, and filtration is the source for the sorting. So you could use a combination of those. Next are the patch and remove functions. And if you want to free yourself from forms within Power Apps, this is a good way how you could do that using the patch and remove. I do understand that you need to take care of handling the data when you're moving back and forth and you want to show it in the controls in the correct way when you update or when you delete. But still, this is a good way that you could just release yourself from using the forms within Power Apps. So for the patch function modifies or creates one or more records in a data source or merges records outside of a data source. So you use the patch function to modify records in complex situations, or if you want to free up yourself from the forms. To update the records in a data source, so you could use as well the patch, but you need to pass in the exact item, or you need to pass something that identifies that item. So for example, you could use the lookup function that we've mentioned earlier, and then pass in the ID of that item, and then you return that exact item that you want to modify. While the remove is just obviously it removes the records from the data source, there are two types of removes function of remove function. The first one is remove, and then you pass in the item that you want to remove, or you use the remove if, which is basically based on a certain criteria or a formula that you pass in. For the patch and remove functions demo, as you can see here, I'm not using a form from Power Apps. Instead, I'm using usual text inputs in here. So meaning that I'm free to use whatever I want in here in terms of design. I do understand that you need to handle whatever is selected from the gallery and back again to the controls. But other than that, you're free to use whatever you want here, and it just gives you more space of work around your data. So for example, if I want to add some data in here, so let's say Norway, and then Oslo, and then say this, and then save that. You can see that the data is added, and then you could just delete the data as well. And I'm only using the patch and remove function. So the patch is either to add or to edit the data, for example. So if I want to add, for example, this, and it just edit it right away. The next is timers. So timers, a timer is a control that can determine how an app responds after a certain amount of time passes. And it's not only just to show the time. So basically, as mentioned, so you could determine what happens after a certain period. And there's a multiple usage for the timers control, which is basically you could do miracles with it in the Power Apps. So for example, if you want to refresh data after a certain amount of time, if you want to execute a bundled functions together or things that you want to do frequently on an app, you could call the timer to call a group or a bundled functions that you already have. You could use that in, for example, splash screens, showing pop-ups, balloon messages, things that we're going to talk about in the next slides. Next is the splash screen. So we mentioned earlier timers, and this is a good use of how to use timers. So this is you tell how the screen should behave after a certain amount of time. And here's the tip here. So what I do is I like to put my controls out of bound instead of put them in hidden. So if you go here to the control and you could see it, so it's out of the bounds of the screen, and you cannot see it, but still you'd see that, yeah, I understand I do have a timer control here. So what I did is after a certain amount of time, which is 2 seconds, this splash screen will move to the next screen, and then it will show the next screen. It's a good use to use splash screens when you're using, for example, in mobile applications. Or if you want to show some important messages while moving from one screen to another for a certain period, you could as well use that. So you could just show some messages and then move to the next screen. So let's show this, and then it will move to the next screen. So next we're going to be talking about rectangles, circles, and icons. And at the beginning, when I started developing using Power Apps, I thought they were just shapes, that there's some kind of like use for them. But when I noticed that if you combine those shapes together, so you will get like, nice headers or nice design. So you could basically, you need to be careful if you want to use images, because you have a limited amount of images that you could upload to a Power App, which is 200 megabytes. It's a quite a good storage, but still you need to be careful when you're uploading that if you have like a really big app and you want to make some really nice design. So what you need to do is actually you could use or utilize those controls that you already have within Power Apps, and you could get a really nice looking headers, for example, or if you want to use them for something else, the sky is your limit in terms of imagination. Now, ever since that we talked about using multiple controls, things could get messy here underneath the screen. So that's why I need to stress on using grouping. So grouping is a really good way that you could bundle controls together, so you could just deal with them as just one unit. So for example, this is bundle underneath country header, as you can see here, and this is for city header, and then you could just move them around as just one entity. And that's why it's really important that you use grouping for that thing, so things does not get messy in here. Now, ever since we talked about grouping, so instead of just grouping controls and then copy and pasting them across your screens, you could also use components. You don't get only the leverage of grouping your controls, but as well, you could just reuse those functionalities that you need to have as well over and over again in your app. And there's a recently released feature which is still in preview. It's called component libraries, which is basically you could use those components cross apps. And that's a really great and amazing feature. And remember that you could just pass parameters in and out from components. And there's like different types that you could pass in as parameters. So for example, that this header that we have here is a component. This balloon message is a component. The one that you see up here is actually a component. Next, we're going to talk about balloon messages. And the messages that you see here is actually based on timers. This is a component that I have created from before, and then I control when it's showing based on the timer control. So you see here that there's like 2 timers in here, and based on those 2 timers, I'm showing those balloon messages. And this is a good way that if you want to drive the user and how to use the app that you have built, you could just show balloon messages, and you could show them on demand, or whether on start of the or on visible of the screen. So that's up to you to decide, but still, like this is a really good way, good trick that you could just use that and make the feel of a real mobile app, like a native app. Next, we're going to talk about loading screen. So the loading screen is usually used for a long process that you are doing against the data source that is taking a long time. And it just basically, you just prevent the user from doing any more clicks on the controls that you have in a screen. So because we're using a local or a global variable that we have here in the app, so I'm just mimicking a long processing operation against the data source. And if I click on save, you could see here that I cannot click around until the loading is done. And this is also mimicking an operation or a long operation that you're doing against the data source. So what I'm using here is just a component that do have a sort of like a transparent background, which is the gray one. So it just grays out everything, and then you have an image in the front, which is the loading image. And then you could see that is actually just giving you the loading screen feel. So this is a really good way of preventing the users from clicking around and probably just adding a record multiple times. Now, pop-ups are very important, especially if you want to show confirmation messages to the users. Like, for example, if you want to show a confirmation on deletion, and you could use your imagination when you're working with confirmation messages. Like, for example, you could use rectangles, and then you could use another rectangle down here. For this one, I've used an input text, actually, and I removed the text because I want to utilize the radius around here, so it just gives it a sort of like a slick look. And I've used an icon here, so it just you close this. And just like loading messages, at the background, you could see that you need to gray out all the controls at the background. So it's just grayed out, and it can't be clicked. It's not clickable. And then you just say, are you sure you want to delete this? And then you put whatever functionality that you want to do here on this button. And as well, this is a good way as well to use grouping. So you could just group everything in here. So you just show and hide whatever you want based on, for example, the click of the trash can here, or if you want to have another button that will show confirmation messages, for example. Now, generating QR codes are becoming more and more common when it comes to mobile development. And ever since that, Power Apps does have the capability of doing a phone layout, which is basically sort of like a native app, sort of. And you probably want to show a QR code, for example. So in this example here, I'm using the Google API, or a Google service that you will pass in a value to it, and it will return a value, or how does the QR code looks. So for example, if I click here, just looking here though, so this is the QR code for Berlin. And if I click here, this is the QR code for Madrid, and so on and so forth. And this is how the QR code looks like. So inside of here, it's chart.googleapis.com, and then you pass in that you want to have a QR code, and then you pass in the value that you want to show the QR code for. In this final demo, we're going to show you how to call a logic app from Power Apps. It's not natively provided by the platform. The only thing that is natively provided is calling a Power Automate. But if you want to call a logic app, that's something is also possible. So for this workaround, we're using an image, and we're setting a local variable value to the URL of that logic app. And the image is actually what it does. It's just trying to get the image by calling that URL. And what happens is actually it ends up calling that URL to that logic app, which the logic app in turn will execute. And based on that, so you could do sort of like a workaround to call a logic app. So let's go into detail. So let's say that if I click on this one, this will send the details for this specific record in here. So let's see how we do that. So if you look here, you will find that there's an image in here, and the image URL gets set by a local variable, which is called call URL. And once I click on this here, so this gets set to the URL of my logic app, and then I pass in some query strings, which is the country, the city, and the population, and then I get that as an email. So you could do whatever you want. Probably you could send some IDs to specific records, and then you get those details for those records in the logic app, and you could send even more details along with the logic app. So this is just a workaround, regardless of how you want to use a logic app with Power Apps, but this is a way that you could call a logic app from Power Apps. That was all. Thank you very much for joining. And if you have any questions, please drop them in. And please make sure that you follow me on Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.